This is Speaking of Writers on Capital Region Sunday. I'm Steve Richards. Marvin Kalb is back with a new book, The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956, Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. It's a chronicle of the year that changed Soviet Russia and molded the future path of one of America's preeminent diplomatic correspondents. Marvin Kalb is a senior advisor to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, a Harvard professor emeritus, former network news correspondent at NBC and CBS, and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Happy to have Marvin Kalb on this program. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve. Nice to be with you.
So why 1956? What about that year?
Well, it was a very exciting year for me, primarily because it was the first time that I was able to spend an extended period of time in the old Soviet Union. I was very fortunate in that the State Department needed somebody at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow who spoke Russian, knew about Russian history, and had top-secret clearance, which I happened to have from a previous U.S. Army intelligence work. So I was sort of perfect for them, and it was certainly perfect for me. I was delighted to have the opportunity of going to Moscow, and it turned out to be a fantastic year. It was the year that Nikita Khrushchev, in February of '56, denounced Joseph Stalin, which was a huge thing for him to do, and a huge thing for the Soviet people and the political system to absorb, because Stalin had been the number one dictator for 28 years.
What was the reaction of the Russian people when that happened?
Well, starting first with the Russian officials who heard it, it was a secret speech delivered in the middle of the night. It ran for 4 hours. And what Khrushchev did was, in denouncing Stalin, shake up the entire communist system, which had been based on an assumption that Stalin was a great genius, knew everything, never made a mistake, and brought Russia to the position of power that it had at that time. Khrushchev knew better. He had lived through some of the awful parts of Stalin's rule, and it took a great deal of guts on his part to do it, and the people in the audience, some of them, what we learned later, some of them literally died of heart attacks. They were so shocked by what it is that Khrushchev was saying. And Ambassador Bolin, who ran the embassy, the American embassy at that time, who was a great ambassador, it took him 3 weeks to find out that there had even been a speech, and then what it was about. And the impact on the Russian people was phenomenal, because they had never had an experience that represented an opportunity to think for themselves, an opportunity for personal freedom. And the idea was that if Khrushchev could denounce Stalin, then nothing was sacred. And not even communism was sacred, and not even Khrushchev was. And the Russian people began, in this intoxicating atmosphere, began to talk about freedom. And I was in a privileged position in that I was very young, very unattached, spoke Russian so I could wander about and hear what it is that people were saying.
We're chatting with Marvin Kalb here on Speaking of Writers. His new book is called The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956. Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. The year was called the Year of the Thaw. You also had a chance to meet and talk with Khrushchev, who gave you that nickname, yes, Peter the Great. What was that like?
Well, that was a marvelous opportunity. That was the July 4th party, and Khrushchev notified Ambassador Bolin that he'd be bringing his entire Politburo, and Bolin said, wow, this is a big deal. We have to prepare for it. The embassy, though, was woefully understaffed, and we only had 4 people there who spoke Russian. And it was the ambassador, me at the bottom of the totem pole, and 2 very good political officers. And the ambassador said, your responsibility is to look after Marshal Zhukov. He was the Minister of Defense, the hero of the Battle of Stalingrad, the man whose finger was on the nuclear button. I was a former PFC in the U.S. Army, and I thought the difference between him and me, just in terms of rank, was absurd. But the ambassador said, this is your chance. And I had a wonderful 45-minute chat with Zhukov. He drank a great deal. I did not. So he drank vodka, I drank water. And after about 40 minutes, Khrushchev beckoned for us to come toward him. We did. And Zhukov shouts out at Khrushchev, "Nikita Sergeyevich," he said, "I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian." Well, that broke everybody up because they knew I didn't drink. I mean, the Russians didn't know, but the guys at the embassy did. And so Khrushchev came over to me. He says, he was about 5'5", and I'm 6'3", and he looked up and he said, "How tall are you?" Now, Zhukov and I had been talking about Peter the Great and his great victorious battle at Poltava in 1709 against Charles XII of Sweden. That was a big deal in Russian history. And Zhukov loved to talk about it. I loved to talk about it. And when Khrushchev called us over and asked me how tall I was, the first thought in my mind was to make a comparison to Peter the Great. And I said, I'm 6 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great, who was 6'8". And Khrushchev loved the line. Everybody laughed. And from then on, even when I went back for CBS a year or two later, he always referred to me as Peter the Great. And as a result of that exchange, he was more willing to give me a scoop than he was some of the other American reporters, and I was very grateful for it.
Talking to Marvin Kalb here on Speaking of Writers. His new book, The Year I Was, Peter the Great, 1956, Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. Marvin, what were your travels like around Russia?
Well, that was really, Steve, one of the highlights of my 13 months there. It was an opportunity to go to parts of the Soviet Union that had been shut, and definitely shut for foreigners, for about 20 years, right throughout World War II. And at the embassy, we hadn't a clue as to what was going on. And Ambassador Bolin was very kind and very sharp. I mean, I asked him if I could travel around the country, and he said, "Yes, but be careful." And so I went off by myself. I did have a diplomatic passport, which was very good for me to have because it gave me an extra sense of personal security. Presumably, they would not want to attack a diplomat, but no one ever knew. And so I traveled throughout the whole area of Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all of the stans of Central Asia, then went into the Caucasus, then went to northern Russia, then went down into Ukraine, which at that time, by the way, was very much part of the Soviet Union. It's not, as it is today, a splintered part of the old Russia. It was in those days part of the Soviet Union, and it gave me an opportunity to test the impact of the Khrushchev speech on the Russian people, and it was immense in every conceivable way. And that feeling of personal freedom, it was a touch, it was a tantalizing touch of it, was so exciting for them. The concept spread into Eastern Europe and led eventually to the tragedy of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, when the Hungarian people wanted very much to be free of Soviet control and wanted to be free of communism completely. And that was a time when Khrushchev had one of the most important decisions of his political life, and that was, do you let Hungary go free, let it just break off, or do you crush them? And like any traditional Russian leader, he chose to crush them, which he did very effectively, and many people were killed. But what it meant for Khrushchev was that the effort to clean up the political system, to inject some significant reform, was shattered. He was then put back into a position similar to Putin today, where you run a country that is huge, that is powerful, but that is not in any way free. And so people who are smart, the Russian people are smart, have no opportunity to express themselves. And that was a tragedy in 1956, and essentially is the tragedy that Putin faces today.
We're talking to Marvin Kalb. His new book is The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956, Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. The book based on a diary you kept. What was it like, Marvin, going back and revisiting this diary and putting this book together?
That's a wonderful question. See, it was an experience the likes of which I have never had. I kept a very informal diary in 1956 on scraps of paper. I just kept it. Didn't look at it then for about 50 years. And then went back to look at it, and I suddenly remembered very exciting things that I had experienced as a young guy in a strange new country for me. And the excitement at that time was discovery of the past, discovery of a young person, really somebody you look back upon almost as a stranger. And it was, for me, an eye-opening experience, a very emotional experience, and I tried to convey some of that anyway in the Peter the Great book, just to give the reader the sense of excitement and discovery that a young American could find in the old Soviet Union.
Another eye-opening and emotional experience you had was your meeting with the legendary Edward R. Murrow.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. When I came back from Russia in February of 1957, I went back up to Harvard and was going off for my PhD at that time. And I began to do some writing about my experiences in the Soviet Union the previous year. One of them was a large piece in the New York Times Magazine. Murrow read it, liked it, called me, and I didn't believe that it was Murrow on the phone. And I told the librarian who picked up the phone, I said, hang up on the guy. He's not, Edward R. Murrow is not calling me. It's ridiculous. And he called back later in the afternoon, and I thought, I better pick up the phone this time. I did. The minute I heard his magnificent voice, I said, Marvin, you are a total fool. And but he was very gracious. And he asked me to come down to talk to him the following day. His secretary said for a half hour. We spoke for 3 hours. Murrow was totally engrossed in what was happening in the Soviet Union, about young Russians, about their married lives, about children, about education, about religion. And I told him everything that I knew, and he then offered me a job. And that was a pretty fantastic experience, because I then went to CBS. It was wonderful.
In our remaining moments with Marvin Kalb, his new book is The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956, Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. Marvin, what is the state of journalism today?
It's in a difficult state for a couple of reasons. One, having to do with the financial underpinning of the industry. It is not what it was many, many years ago when Murrow worked there when I first started. At that time, we were what Bill Paley, the owner of CBS, used to call the jewels in my crown. He really respected and loved the idea of news. And we provided the legitimacy behind which he then accumulated an enormous fortune with Jack Benny and a whole lot of other people who dominated the airwaves. Today, we don't have anything like that at all. We have the tradition of Murrow, but we do not have the reality of Murrow. There is no Edward R. Murrow today. There cannot be. The industry itself has profoundly changed also because of the new technology, the Internet. Everybody fashioning himself today as a journalist who never had any experience doing anything, except everybody thinks that he or she can simply sound off. And so journalism today has lost a good bit of the trust that the American people used to have in it. Walter Cronkite was regarded as the most trusted man in America in the 1980s. He had over 80% approval rating. There is no anchorman today who has even a 20% approval rating. We are in a different world, and the American people are going to have to learn that the only institution in the country that can be relied upon to provide most of the time, not always, most of the time, a reliable, realistic picture of what's happening, which everybody needs, every citizen needs, on which to make an important decision when you vote. And that's the media. We have to somehow find a way of recapturing public trust and affection for the media. That's essential.
What is next for you in your writing?
I'm doing a book called Enemy of the People, and it is a story of the president's war on the press, which I think is disheartening, distressing, and totally wrong. And the idea of enemy of the people, the press is not the enemy of the people. The only person or group that could be the enemy of the people are the people who are trying to suppress freedom of the press. With freedom of the press, we have a good opportunity to have a free society. But if we have people who label us as enemies of the people, we are staring in the face of the true enemy. It's not the press, it's the people who use that phrase.
And what would you like readers to take away from The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956?
Just the excitement, really, of sharing the thrill of a young man going off into a dictatorship, the Soviet Union, 1956, and then being able to travel all over the country and meet Russians, know what they're like, meet the leadership of the Soviet Union, know what they're like. It is an opportunity, I think, in 300-odd pages to have a history lesson and an adventure story all wrapped into one.
Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Marvin Kalb, the book, The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956, Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. And that is Speaking of Writers and Capital Region Sunday, a production of Town Square Media Albany for this week. We're back again next week with another edition. I'm Steve Richards.